Good evening. I'm John Marchari, the head of the Department of Drawings and Prints here at the Morgan, and I have the slightly dubious task of introducing tonight's speaker, who really needs no introduction. Colin is perfectly well known to all of you as the director of this institution and formerly the longtime curator and deputy director at the Frick. His lecture tonight focuses on Boucher's Triumph of Venus, the centerpiece of our exhibition on Treasures from the National Museum, the collections of Count Tessin. This painting is arguably Boucher's masterpiece, but it's a work that has been relatively less discussed than one might imagine, undoubtedly because from the time that Tessin sent it home to Stockholm in 1741 until the beginnings of this exhibition, it has never left Sweden. It was not included in the major Boucher exhibitions, nor was it available for Colin's own 1991-92 exhibition, The Loves of the Gods. Colin touched upon the painting, however, in the Loves of the Gods catalog and suggested that Boucher's canvas might complete the tradition of mythological painting in France. But because the work was not in the show, it received only this brief mention. Now, 25 years later, the work has finally come to an exhibition in America, and tonight Colin will tell us much more. In his lecture, Cospetto, che bella cosa, My, What a Beautiful Thing, Boucher's Triumph of Venus in the National Museum, Stockholm. Please welcome Colin to the podium.
Good evening, and thank you very much, John. That was a sweet introduction. In the summer of 1896, a decade after the competition for the decoration of the staircase hall of Stockholm's National Museum had been launched, in 1896, the 43-year-old artist Carl Larsson unveiled 6 wall panels adorning the lower staircase of the grand entry. His series celebrated the historical origins of the Swedish national collections, from the painter David Ehrenstrahl to the sculptor Tobias Sergel, and his third mural introduces the subject of my lecture this evening. An immaculately bewigged Count Carl Gustaf Tessin is shown reviewing engravings with his sovereign, Queen Louisa Ulrika, whom he had accompanied from Berlin to Stockholm in July 1744 on the occasion of her marriage to the heir to the throne designate, Prince Adolf Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp. With her courtiers admirably immersed in studying folio sheets of old master prints and drawings, everyone seems unaware of the arrival of Boucher's Triumph of Venus in its splendid carved frame that is being unveiled and borne aloft by a trio of putti. We favor more secure methods of transportation and installation at the Morgan Library and Museum. Boucher's Triumph of Venus, painted for Count Gustaf Tessin in the summer of 1740, was sold, along with the greater part of his superb collection of paintings, bronzes, drawings, prints, and books, to King Frederick I in December 1749. In dire financial straits, Tessin had initially arranged for his collection to be auctioned in Amsterdam through the offices of the Swedish merchant Klaus Grimm. At the last minute, the aging king made a New Year's gift of Tessin's collection to the Crown Prince and Princess. Louisa Ulrika informed her mother, Sophia Dorothea, Queen Dowager of Prussia, "The king has given me a present of the magnificent picture cabinet of the Comte de Tessin, which most assuredly consists of only the most beautiful things, containing not only the best works that the French modern school has produced, but also those of the old masters." In the late 1760s, the painting, now in Drottningholm, would inspire one of the most rousing of Carl Michael Bellman Fredman's epistles, Blasen nur alla. And we can sing along if we like. We can read the text in the verses here. Blow now your trumpets, hark the waves swelling and the thunder rumbling. Venus rules where Neptune dwells. Swim all ye Tritons and sing ye millions in praise of Frochau. Respond postilions in Neptune's court. Behold Venus in all her glory. Keeping guard around her are putti, dolphins, zephyrs, Paphos' entire army, with the sea nymphs encircling her in the waves. So you've just had a truly multimedia experience inspired by Boucher's Triumph of Venus. Then, as now, Boucher's Triumph of Venus held pride of place in Tessin's collection. It is, as John said, it is the artist's most beautiful mythological painting, Boucher charged Tessin 1,600 livres. And we can see this in Tessin's immaculate accounts in the Rijksarkivet in Stockholm, Boucher for Malingen och Ramen, the painting and the frame. And the ambassador remitted payment on the 26th of August 1740. This was by far the most money that Tessin would spend on a single painting during the 3 years he resided in Paris as ambassador without portfolio between July 1739 and July 1742. It was his fourth and final visit to the city. The following year, in the spring of 1741, he would buy more than 2,000 Old Master drawings and modern drawings from the Cosa sale for just over 5,000 livres. And these still form the core of the National Museum's exceptional graphic collection today, and of course are the reason for this celebratory exhibition at the Morgan. The Triumph of Venus was one of 3 paintings of similar dimension, each signed and dated 1740, that Boucher exhibited at the Salon of 1740, which took place in the Louvre between August 22nd and September 15 that year. This unusual triptych comprised, in addition, a pair of landscapes painted for another discriminating collector, the farmer general Marin de la Haye, the view of a mill with distant temple in the Nelson Atkins Museum today, and a forest scene with 2 Roman soldiers in the Louvre. All 3 paintings are exactly of the same dimension. We know that they were hung together, but we do not know the order in which they were seen. And although Boucher had been at work on Tessin's Triumph of Venus since the early summer, at least, he had yet to be paid when he delivered the picture to the Salon. Tessin's name as owner does not appear in the Salon Livre, the catalogue that accompanied the Salon, although the Swedish ambassador was represented at that Salon by 2 other significant commissions: Abed's portrait of him in his library, Udry's portrait of his beloved dachshund Pa, both in the exhibition. To be absolutely secure in his ownership, perhaps, Tessin made payment to Boucher 4 days after the Salon opened its doors. Boucher's Triumph of Venus, Boucher's Birth of Venus, as it was entitled at the Salon of 1740, shows Venus, the goddess of love, on a glorious summer's day, emerging fully formed from the ocean. She is portrayed with a blush of red on her cheeks, pearls entwined in her hair, and her snow-white body is untouched by the water. Seated on her carriage of a magnificent shell covered in white silk with a swathe of powder blue, she is surrounded by no fewer than 21 attendants, 11 putti, 9 of whom are airborne, an escort of 4 tritons, one of whom holds her conveyance steady, that's him, 5 nereids, beautiful, melodious sea nymphs who could be helpful and kind to sailors when they chose, and a junior conch-blowing triton, learning his trade at far left. Also depicted are 5 doves and 3 dolphins. Serene, amidst this jubilant and noisy celebration, Venus is shaded from the sun by a swirling canopy of pink and white silk, held aloft by 3 of the gambolling putti. A red-haired nereid, supported by a muscular triton with seaweed dripping from his head, inspired perhaps by a sculpture such as this by Gian Bologna, offers the goddess a shell filled with pearl. And this was the only detail deemed sufficiently modest by the MTA to allow us to use in our subway campaign for the Triumph, for this exhibition. If any of you come across other juxtapositions, please send them to us. In the foreground of Boucher's painting, Venus's companions disport themselves in languorous and voluptuous poses. The male and female deities are unabashed in their nudity, and here Boucher may well have derived inspiration from Bernini's magnificent Triton fountain that he was familiar with in Rome. The nereid on the left of Boucher's painting is shown with her head resting against the dolphin's tail. Her eyes are closed, and her finger caresses what I assume to be the dove's neck, but that may be open to discussion. She is one of the most carnal figures in Boucher's repertory and is represented with unprecedented license and abandon. She will reappear as the ecstatic Venus in Mars's bed a decade or so later in a picture from the Wallace collection. It is not altogether surprising that a contemporary review of the Triumph of Venus noted the painting's excessive grace, which strict morality does not permit us to encourage. Surprisingly, this was the single extended commentary on the painting in the art press of the time. Most unusually for him, Boucher appears to have worked on the Triumph of Venus with a minimum of preparation. The composition may be said to have emerged Athena-like from his head. In fact, it was Boucher's custom to plot the creation of his history paintings meticulously through compositional studies in oil or chalk, followed by preparatory drawings for individual figures, which might focus on facial expression, heads, or details of drapery. For example, we can consider an early treatment by Boucher of the same theme, the Triumph of Venus, painted around 1732-3 as part of a decorative series for a Parisian lawyer. Today, this magnificent work, rediscovered 20 years ago, whose varnish has yellowed considerably, is part of the interior of the Romanian embassy in Paris, the Hôtel de Béarn. We can see how carefully Boucher prepared two of his nereids in red and black chalk drawings, probably drawn from the live model. For another painting in this same series, The Rape of Europa from the Wallace collection, we have a sketch in grisaille, a more animated Jupiter as the bull, impatient to lure the innocent princess of Tyre to the ocean beyond. And one more example, a little later from the 1750s, Venus requesting Vulcan to make arms for Aeneas, a model for a Gobelin tapestry cartoon, which Boucher prepared first in grisaille, and then again in a sketch in full color, now in the Clark Museum in Williamstown. No such preparations exist for the Triumph of Venus, for Tessin. We have a record of one oil sketch described in April 1786 as a first thought for the painting, owned by Boucher's patron and Fragonard's patron, the financier Bergeret de Grandcourt. This oil sketch has yet to reappear. With an eye to recording and possibly replicating the commission, which Boucher never did, he appears to have etched the Triumph of Venus himself. At least two examples are recorded. Neither of these survive, but they may have served, and probably must have served, as the model for Moit's engraving of Venus on the Waters that was presented at the Académie Royale in Paris as his admission piece in June 1760. Since Tessin had shipped his picture home in the summer of 41, Moit must have had access to an excellent record of the painting to engrave such a faithful composition 20 years later. Even more surprising, not a single preparatory drawing can be associated with Boucher's Triumph of Venus. The few that have been identified as such are in fact autonomous drawings made after certain figures and groups in the painting that served as models for engravings. So no drawings, no extant sketches. Technical examination has allowed us to confirm the assurance and fluency with which Boucher created this complex, sophisticated composition. Recent infrared reflectography taken on the occasion of this exhibition has revealed almost no significant revisions or alterations. Such was his fastidiousness that Boucher painted out. Look at these three putti here. He painted them out at one point, only to return them to the painting in its final version. Boucher also suppressed the dove that he had painted on by Venus's right hand, which you can still see looking hard at the painting itself coming through, but he painted it out. X-radiography. We thought we might discover something, perhaps some development in the gestation of this picture, and one significant alteration appears. I want you to focus on the sea nymph at right, who's shown here. She was initially portrayed as fully immersed in the ocean's foamy waves. So here she is in the X-ray, and here are the waves that cover her. Boucher then decided to expose her ample waist and buttocks. Why stop there? And this was consistent with the unapologetic carnality of the mythological painting as a whole. Finally, examination of the back of the canvas, unlined and still on its original stretcher, has revealed further information. And I'm going to look at this part here. With some effort, we decipher a transcription here on the canvas, and we think it reads, soldoni, 10 deniers. It's very hard. And one way of interpreting this is to suggest that a certain Monsieur Soldoni was paid relatively little money, perhaps to prime the canvas before Boucher set about painting the actual composition. Carl Gustaf Tessin, born in 1695, died in 1770, was among the best-traveled, most visually sophisticated connoisseurs and collectors to have made Boucher's acquaintance. The son and grandson of court architects, the husband of Ulrica Louisa Spara, Ulla, goddaughter to Louis XIV. Tessin was wealthy and profligate, fluent in several languages, an able draftsman and designer, and deeply interested in the history of art. As a young man in his early 20s, between July 1714 and September 1720, he had spent almost 6 years abroad on and off on an extended grand tour in preparation for succeeding his father as court architect and surveyor of buildings. Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, his father, had admonished him, "I am delighted that you are committed to becoming a connoisseur of painting, but architecture must be your principal objective." Tessin had been charged with acquiring prints, drawings, and books to supplement his father's extensive collection, which he would inherit in 1728. In the summer of 1715, he befriended the 30-year-old Watteau, and 3 years later acquired examples of some of his most audacious drawings. A drawing probably done in a private session, one of several drawings of these models undressed, someone signing, inscribing the drawing as Watteau, Tessin in his ink saying, "Yes, oui." It is absolutely by Watteau. On his honeymoon to Paris with his 17-year-old bride Ulla in the winter of 1728-9, and the Dachshund pair is here in a younger, slimmer iteration. On his honeymoon to Paris in 1728-9, Tessin made superb acquisitions of cabinet pictures by Nicolas Lancret, François Lemoine, and Nicolas Coipel, the leading lights of the French school, all of which are in the exhibition upstairs. Neither Boucher nor Chardin were prominent enough at this time to come to Tessin's attention. Tessin would note in his journal in 1759, "I dearly love the arts, but if I were to set my hand as a practitioner, it would be to their dishonor." Yet he clearly had a very sophisticated appreciation of painting and drawing, Old Master and modern. As a young man on his European grand tour, he had met Watteau and identified him as the leading artist of his day. During his second ambassadorship to Vienna, as an older, a more experienced collector in 1735 and 6, he was appalled. He took advantage of the imperial collection, but he was appalled by the way that the pictures were treated. To a diplomatic colleague in Berlin, he wrote, "Recently, I went to the picture gallery, where I came across a hack in the throes of retouching, you'll never guess what, a painting by Titian. And this fellow receives an annual pension for ruining all the emperor's pictures. I was tempted to strike the blasphemer with my glove." Tessin's posting to Vienna allowed him to spend 2 weeks in Venice in May 1736, where he immediately identified the leading painters, Canaletto, Pittoni, Piazzetta, Cimaroli, but was in no doubt that the greatest of them all was the 37-year-old Giambattista Tiepolo, whom he called Tiepoletto. "He's exactly what we need," he wrote, "spirited, obliging, with fire and brilliant color, who finishes his paintings in less time than it takes another to grind his colors." Tessin acquired 2 early masterpieces from Tiepolo, including this extremely sensuous depiction of Danae receiving Jupiter as a shower of gold, a picture that is much, much smaller than it's seen on the screen, and is today in the Stockholm University Art Collection. Tessin had hoped to lure Tiepoletto, as he called him, to Stockholm in 1736, as he did Udry and Pater. None of them, this is Udry, none of them accepted his offer. Tessin seems to have first taken note of François Boucher in May 1737. His banker and agent in Paris, a man called Henry Barish, wrote to Tessin with disappointing news. I have been with Monsieur Boucher the painter, inquiring about the little painting that your excellency wished for. But when I told him my price, he would not listen. It would require at least 300 livres to commission him to work on a subject as you would like. He's a very busy young man, working all the time for the king and the court, and is so convinced of his own ability and so much in demand that he counts himself among the most famous. And to be truthful, in Paris today, he is considered one of the greatest. The two men would meet for the first time just over 2 years later, within days of Tessin's arrival in Paris on the 30th of July, 1739, with his wife Ulla, shown here in a beautiful portrait by Nattier, his niece Lotta, his nephew Frederick, his dog Pa, and his parrot Jacob. On the 3rd of August, Tessin was introduced to Boucher in Boucher's studio by a Swedish artist, Carl Gustaf Lundberg, who was a pastelist and portrait painter then resident in Paris. In September 1739, Tessin made his first acquisition from Boucher, a woman with a parrot in grisaille for 100 livres, known only today from this print. Along with Woman Applying a Mouche, that also entered Tessin's collection. These were early works by Boucher, not painted expressly for the Count. During his 3-year stay in Paris, Tessin commissioned several masterpieces from Boucher, most of a libertine, erotic nature, as well as many drawings. He commissioned a tender portrait in 3 crayons of his niece Carlotta Spar in exchange for a pair of small cabinet pictures by Isaac Ostade. In March 1742, Tessin acquired this wintry landscape by Philips Wouvermans from Boucher, himself an avid collector, for 350 livres. And at some point, before the summer of 1741, Tessin had also bought a pair of terracotta sculptures by Boucher. Moderalda figura, as they're noted in his account books, representing a shoeshine boy and a Savoyard woman in a headscarf. And this, as far as I know, is the single visual indication we have of Boucher's activity as a sculptor. Soon after arriving in Paris, Tessin gave a reading in his salon of Fonillon, or the Yellow Infanta, a fairy tale he had written in 1738 in Stockholm to relieve the boredom of attending the annual session of the Swedish Riksdag. And we have a copy of this in the exhibition. Among the luminaries in attendance when Tessin read his fairy tale were the connoisseur and writer and arbiter of the arts, the Comte de Caylus, the author and playwright Marivaux, and Boucher, the painter. Tessin went on to commission Boucher to illustrate a luxury edition of this tale with 10 drawings. Only 3 copies of the book were printed, and Tessin hung Boucher's drawings, framed and glazed, in his bedchamber. He would leave them as a gift to the artist when he returned to Stockholm in the summer of 1742. 2 versions of the book are in the Royal Collection in Sweden, and 1 version is in the New York Public Library, which we have on view. In the 1760s, it was widely rumored in Paris that Tessin had commissioned Boucher to illustrate this fairy tale so that he could visit the painter in the company of his beautiful wife, Marie-Jeanne Bouzeau, with whom it was claimed he was infatuated. Another noble patron of Boucher's wrote around this time, Madame Boucher was not just the most beautiful woman in Paris, but in the whole of France, and was as virtuous as she was beautiful, making herself generally loved and esteemed. Both Tessin and Boucher had married wives who were half their age, and both seem to have been uxorious and to have enjoyed long and happy marriages. It is nonetheless true that Tessin commissioned a portrait in pastel from Boucher of Madame Boucher, made her gifts of a silk dress and a snuff box, and invited her to perform at his home, where she apparently sang like an angel. Tessin also owned the single pen and ink drawing that Madame Boucher is thought to have made, Madame Boucher in Tessin's writing, d'après François Boucher, a copy of a Jean Racine by her husband. Poor Boucher and his beautiful wife were among those who, with tears in their eyes, sent their regards to Tessin in February 1743, asking when they might be allowed to visit him in Stockholm. So, an exceptional painting for an exceptional patron. Brilliant and ambitious in conception and organization, its complex interlocking figural groups modeled with supreme assurance, The Triumph of Venus has recently been described as an exquisitely finished historical composition and perfect in size as well as execution. As such, it constitutes Boucher's signal achievement. The painting conforms to the Goncourt brothers' notion of voluptuousness as the essence and ideal of Boucher's art. These 19th century writers never visited Stockholm and knew the painting only from the engraving. But their inspired writing on Boucher, which would re-establish his standing and his reputation from the 1760s on, still serves as a good starting point. What felicitous movement there is in his goddesses, whose bodies unfurl like garlands in the sky. What display of flesh in bloom, of undulating curves, of forms that might have been modeled by a caress. The freedom, grace, and naturalness of Boucher's densely populated Cytherean seascape were the product of impeccable academic training, which demanded immersion in both literary and visual sources. As Count Tessin noted in 1751 in an open letter to his pupil, Crown Prince Gustav, later Gustav III, one of painting's chief uses was that it may be considered an agreeable introduction to the knowledge of ancient fable and real history, for the generality of good painters have been good mythologists and good historians. The gory origins of Venus's birth were recounted in Hesiod's Theogony, which described how the slender-footed goddess was nurtured in the foam of the ocean, created from the discarded genitals of the sky god Uranus. The spectacle of Venus, accompanied by her Nereids and Tritons, appears in the fourth book of Lucius Apellius's Golden Ass, a Latin novel in 11 books written towards the end of the 2nd century, and translated into French in several 18th century editions that would have been available to Boucher. The goddess, and I'm now quoting, the goddess, seeking the nearest strand of tide-swept shore, stepped on rose-tinted feet over the trembling crests of the foaming waves and stood once more on the crystal surface of the deep. The ocean instantly obeyed her wishes as if commanded in advance. The Nereids were there singing a choral song. Portunus, the god of harbors with his sea-green beard. Salacia, Neptune's wife, her lamp alive with fish. And Palemon, the dolphin's little charioteer. Troops of tritons too leapt here and there in the water. One blew softly on a melodious conch. Another with a cinque parasol shielded her from the sun's hostile blaze. Another held a mirror to his mistress's eyes, while yet more swam harnessed in pairs to her chariot. Such was the throng escorting Venus as she moved into the sea. Whereas 17th century mythographers had portrayed Venus as the goddess of voluptuousness and luxury, the source of mankind's concupiscence and discordant lascivious desires, by the 18th century, by the beginning of the century, there was a newly established guilt-free iconographical tradition for the representation of Venus's birth. And this iconographical tradition also served for the related marine mythologies of the triumph of Galatea and the story of Neptune and Amphitrite. Academicians of the generation prior to Boucher's, this is by Pierre Cars, Chardin's teacher, academicians of this earlier generation treated the subject in generally pyramidical, static, multi-figured compositions that contained several variants of the female nude. And it's a tradition that continues right into the 1770s and 80s, an example here by Gaetano Gandolfi. In preparing his Triumph of Venus for Tessin, Boucher looked to the same sources, the same visual sources, as these earlier artists had done, notably Raphael's Triumph of Galatea, from the Loggia di Galatea in the Villa Farnesina. Boucher may well have seen this mural decoration during the years he spent in Rome as an unofficial pensionnaire of the Academy, but he would also have known the composition through Marcantonio Raimondi's print after Raphael. The latter print here is indeed the same print that Tessin is shown holding in his hands. It was one of the trophies of Nicodemus's collection, and it is clutched in Aved's portrait by the Count in a manner that would be considered unacceptable today. Boucher would also have known Poussin's wonderful Triumph of Venus, today in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, itself indebted to Raphael and one of the most surpassingly beautiful marine mythologies in French art. Neptune's billowing blue cloak seems to have found its way onto the seating of Venus's chariot in Boucher's composition. And while Boucher undoubtedly would have had access to Pen's engraving after Poussin's composition, it is quite possible that he would also have been able to study the original painting in the flesh, as it were. Recent research has shown that in the 1730s and early 40s, Poussin's Triumph of Venus, then thought to represent the triumph of Galatea, was part of a gallery of pictures owned by the immensely wealthy financier Antoine Crozat. On the right, elder brother to the banker Pierre Crozat, some of whose drawings Tessin acquired. It was owned by Crozat and his wife, Marguerite Legendre Crozat, you see at the left. In the probate inventory taken after Madame Crozat's death, there is listed a triumph by Poussin, valued at 1,000 livres, hanging in the gallery of her Hôtel Particulier on the Place Vendôme. Maddeningly, the document does not specify whether it's a triumph of Venus or a triumph of Galatea. It refers to the painting simply as un triomphe. In her will, written a week before her death, Madame Crozat left the lion's share of her collection to the youngest of her 4 children, Louis-Antoine Crozat, Baron de Thiers. Boucher was well acquainted with this family. He designed a bookplate for de Thiers, and in the year that he was working for Tessin, he was commissioned by the Thiers' elder brother, the Président de Tunis, to paint a small ceiling for the library of his Hôtel Particulier. No traces of this commission survive, but it's very clear that Boucher had access and perhaps even worked for the family who owned Poussin's masterpiece. Raphael and Poussin's examples had also informed Boucher's earlier Triumph of Venus, Birth of Venus that we've discussed, painted in the 1730s. This picture is twice the size of Tessin's and is dominated by the serpentine figure of the standing goddess, keeping her balance amid a triad of fleshy nereids and ferocious dolphins. While exuberant, the composition, and Rubensian, the composition is more monumental, less populated than Tessin's would be. And as in Poussin's marine mythologies, the figures and sea creatures are placed decidedly close to the picture plane, offering little access to the Cnidian coastline beyond. Perhaps a more potent influence on Boucher's multifigured Birth of Venus was Noel Nicolas Coipel's radiant Rape of Europa in the Philadelphia Museum of Art today. This was one of the outstanding entries to the competition of 1727, a competition among senior history painters held in the Louvre, which Boucher in his mid-20s had likely seen again and again. Now, the subjects of these pictures are not the same, but both works share essential characteristics: an open composition, dynamic groupings, a pleasure in naturalistic effects, and the crystalline finish appropriate for large cabinet pictures. Whether Coipel's masterpiece was available to Boucher in the summer of 1740 is difficult to know. The picture had never been engraved. And what role, if any, did Count Tessin himself play in the gestation and development of Boucher's masterpiece? Writing a couple of decades later, the philosophe Denis Diderot, no great friend of Boucher's, described the model patron of contemporary art in the following way. One should never commission anything from an artist. If one wants a fine painting from him, all that needs to be done is to say, "Make me a painting," and choose whatever subject you wish. An even better way is to buy one already painted. This was most decidedly not the case for Tessin and Boucher. In a letter of the late 1740s to his correspondent in Stockholm, the architect Carl Harleman, seen on the right, Tessin stated quite explicitly that Boucher was doing a Birth of Venus for him. Boucher me fait une naissance de Vénus. As patron, Tessin would have expected to have a say at the very least in the subject matter and size of Boucher's composition. As my colleague from the National Museum in Stockholm, Magnus Olufsen, has recently noted, Tessin had a firm sense of his role in the creative process, to use a somewhat anachronistic term. With regard to the portraitist Gustav Lundberg, he explained in a letter to Queen Louisa Ulrika, "I am a man of ideas. Lundberg is a man of talent. I will tell him the emblems he is to paint, he will paint them. I will dictate, he will immortalize." One shudders to think of Tessin speaking in such terms to Boucher or Chardin, but instructions of this sort may have inspired his commission to Lancret of an unusually monumental Fastening the Skate, acquired in July 1741 for 400 livres, a subject obviously fitting to the wintry seasons in Stockholm. At the very least, then, as patron, Tessin would have had a say in the subject matter and size of Boucher's composition. A recently discovered letter from the history painter François Lemoine, Boucher's teacher, to Carl Gustaf Tessin, dated January 1729, establishes that Tessin as a patron expected to be kept informed on the progress of his commissions by word or by letter. Lemoine writes, "I have executed the idea for your painting and will now do it as a vertical. The figures will be larger and the effect will be more dignified, de plus grande manière." The letter implies that the idea for the subject of the painting had already been established in discussion between the two men, and that Lemoine was preparing Tessin for the final result. It should be noted that this was exactly what the Count would have expected, since Lemoine's picture on the right, Venus and Adonis, was most likely commissioned as a companion or pendant to Noël Nicolas Coipel's Judgment of Paris. Both were appropriate subjects to celebrate Tessin's recent nuptials to Ulrica Louisa Spara, and both pictures can be seen in the exhibition, flanking Boucher's Triumph of Venus. It's difficult to imagine Tessin dictating terms to Boucher, but it is known that he commissioned the Triumph of Venus from him in the spring or summer of 1740. The ambassador at that point was living in a hovel, he wrote, un taudis, on the Rue Jacob. And in July 1740, Tessin had been tempted to purchase Poussin's magisterial pendants, the Adoration of the Golden Calf in the National Gallery in London, on the upper left, and the Crossing of the Red Sea in the National Gallery of in the National Gallery of New South Wales in Melbourne. These had appeared at the auction of the Treasurer General Bélanger. Tessin writes to his friend Harleman, "My heart bleeds to see all those fine paintings in the deceased treasurer's collection being sold at auction, among which are two of the most beautiful Poussins imaginable. You know them from the prints. They fetch 7,900 livres for the pair, and the frames alone are worth 3,000 livres. The good Lord made it possible for me to resist this time, but it is a harsh setback for my tableaumanie, my picture mania." Tessin's picture mania suffered only a temporary setback. Around this time, in early July 1740, while Boucher was at work on his Triumph of Venus, Tessin and his entourage moved into the elegant Hôtel de Villemur on the Quai des Tétans, opposite the Louvre, today 911 Quai Voltaire, which he rented for the considerable sum of 8,500 livres. From his correspondence, we know that Boucher was still working on the Triumph of Venus on the 22nd of July, but that the composition must have been fairly advanced by then. After a visit to Boucher's studio that day, Tessin reported to Harleman, "Cospetto, quel bella cosa, only eyes like yours are worthy of seeing it." Boucher's mythology would certainly have pride of place in Tessin's bedchamber in the rented Hôtel Villemur, until it was shipped back to Stockholm in August 1741. But it was likely commissioned to hang in a prominent place in the first floor picture gallery of the Tessinska Palatset at Slottsbacken, the townhouse built by Tessin's father, Nicodemus, in 1697, opposite the Royal Palace, where Tessin and Ulla had resided since 1728. And here's a picture of the garden taken last November in a massive snowstorm in Stockholm that rendered it impossible for a week. In considering the subject of Boucher's painting, Tessin may have recalled his father's commission to Antoine Coipel for A Birth of Venus in 1699. This cabinet picture was intended for the 17-year-old King Carl XII, of an age to prefer the graceful to the serious. And for almost 1 year, between June 1699 and May 1700, Tessin's father had corresponded with the architect Daniel Kronstrom, who was resident in Paris, to secure a painting from the 38-year-old history painter Antoine Coipel. From a short list of 16 possible subjects, artist and patron finally settled upon 3, ultimately choosing the amiable and graceful subject of the birth of Venus. In the end, nothing came of the commission, but Coipel's preparatory black and red chalk compositional drawing, sent back from Paris to Stockholm for royal approval, had entered Tessin's collection after the death of his father, and this was a drawing that Carl Gustaf had known for a long time. In the course of Nicodemus Tessin's commission to Coipel, he had been informed by his agent Kronstrom that Kronstrom and Coipel were going to read carefully the authors who have treated the 3 subjects under consideration, and only then will we make our choice. And it's possible that Tessin fils and Boucher followed a similar path in the summer of 1740. A month after arriving in Paris, Tessin would likely have visited the Salon of 1739, held that year between the 6th and 30th of September in the Louvre. This would have been his first exposure to paintings by Chardin and Boucher. The Salon was dominated by Boucher's monumental cartoon for a tapestry for the Beauvais manufactory, showing the inaugural scene in the story of Psyche, in which Zephyr ushers Psyche into Cupid's palace. So this is the tapestry itself. It's not the cartoon, which is no longer extant, but it gives you a very good sense of the color, energy, ambition of these Beauvais cartoons. Boucher had undertaken, Boucher would work on the remaining tapestries in the series during Tessin's stay in Paris in the mid-40s. Tessin would order a series of this set for the Royal Palace, where they remain today. Boucher had undertaken the tapestry commission for Beauvais with the utmost seriousness of purpose, and he had applied to the respected connoisseur and arbiter of taste, Louis Petit de Bachaumont, for assistance with the historical and literary aspects of the series. Bachaumont was in no doubt as to the sources that Boucher should consult. He writes to him, "For the love of you, I have reread La Fontaine's Cupid and Psyche. You are a lucky Apelles to have a flesh and blood Psyche living with you. You should also consult Raphael's Psyche, engraved by Marc Antonio Raimondi, which can be found in either Monsieur Cosa or Monsieur Mariette's collection. But my best advice is to read and reread the Psyche of La Fontaine, and above all, look long and hard at Madame Boucher." La Fontaine's Les Amours de Psyché et Cupidon, first published in 1669, was republished 9 times between 1700 and 1728. It brought Apuleius' Golden Ass up to date and followed a similar narrative. In both works, the description of the triumph of Venus is but a short interlude in the story of Psyche's endless trials and tribulations. Apuleius and La Fontaine both describe Venus returning to Cythera in triumph after she secures a promise from her son Cupid to avenge her by making Psyche fall in love with a vagrant wretch frightful of face. This part of the story, La Fontaine writes, is more properly a subject for poetry. 'Twould ill become prose to attempt the description of a cavalcade of sea gods. I'm quoting now from John Lockman's English translation, The Loves of Cupid and Psyche, published in London in 1744 and dedicated to the academician Fontenelle, Bernard de Fontenelle, who was one of Tessin's heroes and friends in Paris. Just bear with me while I read the section. "In verse we'll therefore tell that Neptune's train see her with transport gild the liquid plain. The august procession Triton's head with joy, and to divert her all their skill employ. Some round her sport, for coral others haste, or draw new treasures from the watery waste. One holds a glass in which her beauty plays, another screens her from the solar rays. Her guide, Palemon, shuns each rock with care, whilst Glaucus' shell loud echoes through the air. Sirens by Thetis called delight her ear. The winds to silence charmed can only hear. All but Zephyrus, who breathes amorous sighs round the bright queen and through each ringlet flies. Whilst in her fluttering veil he seems to dance, to touch her, waves over heaving waves advance. Each joyful surge in murmurs strive to greet the smiling goddess and to kiss her feet." Having been immersed in the literary source for his tapestry series for Beauvais, It's not hard to think of Boucher's visual imagination, and that of Tessin's as well, as being stirred by La Fontaine's poetic description of Venus's noisy and jubilant return home. A later passage in La Fontaine's tale offers a second image that might have served as well. We read that Psyche comes across the exquisite temple built in honor of Venus, whose tympanum is decorated with figures sculpted in high relief. This passage is rendered in prose, not verse. Venus was seated on her shell, in the condition of a person who has bathed and just emerged from the water. She is attended by graces, mermaids, zephyrs, and putti. For Venus was born with her entire entourage, fully grown, fully formed, and ready both to receive and give love. Fully grown, fully formed, ready both to receive and give love. Boucher's revival of a pictorial tradition established by Raphael and Poussin, and a classical literary tradition reanimated by La Fontaine, was in many ways distinctly modern and Parisian as well. For in his recreation of this mythical Cythera and its presiding goddess for Count Tessin, Boucher's imagination was also stirred by the new language of rococo ornament, of which he was the prime mover, and the taste for shells and rocks that together came to dominate elite culture in Paris and beyond in the late 1730s and 40s. From the mid-1730s, Boucher was the single history painter of the Royal Academy to participate fully in the formation of a new language of ornament and interior decoration, the organic and asymmetrical style known as rocaille, or today as the rococo. Boucher's flamboyant, fanciful images for fountains, panels, screens incorporated sea deities and marine creatures, as well as a dazzling array of shells and incrustations, sea fans, aquatic flora and fauna. This was the world to which he gave poetic form as a history painter in The Triumph of Venus. At the same time, Boucher's services were in demand to illustrate both commercial and scholarly compendia devoted to natural curiosities. By the 1760s, Boucher would have assembled one of the finest cabinets of shells and natural history in Paris. His frontispiece for Desalliés d'Argenville's treatise on shells and shell collecting, L'histoire naturelle de la lithologie et de la conchology, published in 1742, derives, as we can see, from Tessin's Triumph of Venus. Tessin himself was an avid shell collector, and he had inherited an important collection of shells from his father. In the 1750s and 1760s, Tessin maintained a regular correspondence with the celebrated botanist Carl Linnaeus, professor at Uppsala University. Like many advanced patrons and collectors in Paris, such as Monsieur de Julienne, Watteau's great patron, Tessin was also a subscriber to Desalliés' book, Porcelaine, from the collection of Monsieur le Comte de Tessin, surintendant des bâtiments du roi de Suède. In his 50s, Tessin had to sell off most of the paintings and drawings he had acquired during his ambassadorship in Paris, including Boucher's Triumph of Venus. Yet Boucher's rococo language remained constantly before him in his final years. In retirement in his country house at Acquerot, in the county of Södermanland, Tessin decorated his wife's petit cabinet with a trompe-l'oeil by Olof Fridsberg, which we know from this watercolor. Along with Tessin, Boucher presides in this space. His two sculptures adorn the secrétaire. Just to remind you. Boucher's calling card for the Dealer Gersaint, à la pagode, engraved by the Comte de Caylus, is writ large upon the door. And when we look at the trompe-l'oeil door itself, and I thank Jada Dama for discovering this, when we look at the door in its entirety, something that is not possible in Friedberg's watercolor, we see what must have greeted Tessin and Ulla every morning. A laughing Chinese botanist and a Chinese soldier, armed, stepping forth, and ready for the day. Thank you. And we invite everyone to join us for a drink following, which we're outside. And again, thank you all for coming this evening.